Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about politics during the Gilded Age. Now, Gilded Age politics stood in the shadow of Lincoln and the Civil War, Lincoln being considered one of the greatest American presidents ever, and the Civil War being the greatest event in American history. What came during the Gilded Age regarding politics seems sort of tame and sometimes boring. In the later period of the Gilded Age, there's a grassroots political movement called the Populist Movement, or sometimes the Populist Era. This kind of bubbles up through the 1870s, 1880s, and then it peaks in the 1890s. The Populist Movement is sort of this stage in between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. We'll have a whole separate lecture on the Populist Movement, so I'm not going to address that in this lecture. We'll basically cover politics of the 1890s at another date. Now, between 1877 and 1897, there's 5 presidents during the Gilded Age, 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And as you can see from these pictures, it makes sense why some refer to this as the golden era of facial hair. These are all the presidents with pretty big beards or mustaches, and nobody really remembers them. And as you can also tell from these election maps, Republicans do well in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, while the Democrats did the best in the South. We call the South solid, or we call it the solid South because it always goes for the Democrats. The only way Democrats really can win elections during this Gilded Age era is to pick off a few Republican stronghold states in the North. Now, the presidency is very different in the Gilded Age than what it is today. The duties of the presidents of this era were very modest as compared to today. Now, the president was still the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The president is still the chief executive of the nation, his main job being to enforce the laws. Often the most demanding task for the president during this era was dispensing patronage to supporters of the party. Under the spoils system, something created by the Democrat President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, government jobs were handed out by the party that won the election to those who supported them. So you don't get a government job based on whether or not you're qualified. You get a government job based on whether or not you supported the person that won the election. But during this Gilded Age period, presidents leave most issues up to Congress, especially the budget. The Gilded Age is referred to, or Woodrow Wilson referred to it as the era of congressional government. He's going to be a progressive president. We're going to look at it a little bit later on. It won't really be until 1901 that we see a very strong executive in the person of Teddy Roosevelt in the presidency. So a lot of these presidents don't take a front seat to most events during the Gilded Age. The federal government is very small during the Gilded Age. There's about 100,000 federal employees, and 56% of those work in the post office. The federal government makes most of its money from tariffs, which are taxes on imports, or excise taxes, which are basically domestic taxes on things like tobacco and liquor. So there's no income tax. There was an income tax during the Civil War, but then it goes away afterwards. It won't be until the progressives later on in the 1900s that we have an income tax. So there's not very many taxes in America at this time either. Now, I kind of want to do a generalization about what each party stood for. Remember, these aren't absolutes. These are just generally what they represented. Now, the Republicans tended to favor a strong federal government. Not strong like we think of it today, but for the era, they were the party of big government. They support civil rights for blacks. I want to read to you a little speech from James A. Garfield. He's president during this time period. He said, quote, "Gentlemen, ideas outlive men. Ideas outlive all human things. And all that we mean today by our meeting as veterans and comrades is to stand as a sacred guard about the truth for which we fought. We have seen white men betray the flag and fight to kill the Union, but in all that long and dreary war you never saw a traitor under a black skin. In all that period of terror and distress no Union soldier was ever betrayed by any black man anywhere, and as long as we live we'll stand by these black allies of ours. We will stand by them until the equal sunlight of liberty shall shine upon every man, black or white, in the Union. Citizens of New York, thank you for this magnificent demonstration. Thank you, thank you. So this is an example of James A. Garfield, a Republican and Civil War veteran, pointing out that the Civil War was caused by Democrats and blacks helped preserve the Union. So after the Civil War, Republicans fight for civil rights for blacks. Republicans also support a high tariff. Tariffs support big business. So a good example is we as a nation tax steel coming into America. This makes British steel or European steel more expensive, so more people are willing to buy American. So this helps businessmen in America. Republicans tend to be Protestant, and they tend to be located in the North. Republicans tend to favor limits on alcohol. Sometimes they want counties not to sell alcohol. Sometimes they want to ban alcohol in an entire state. So they tend to favor limits on alcohol, and they see alcohol as kind of this negative thing that impacts society in a bad way. Republicans, like I said, are the party of big business. They do have farmers that support the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is mainly, their strength is mainly in the North. Now, the Democrats, on the other hand, they're the party of states' rights, so they want a weak federal government. Some of this is because if there's a weak federal government, that means they can discriminate more easily against blacks. Others that support states' rights do it kind of out of this traditional view that big government is a threat to liberty. The Democrats are also the party of segregation, as we'll kind of see today at the end of this lecture. I want to read to you a quote from Ida B. Wells. She was a civil rights advocate in the late 1800s. She said this, quote, "I am not a Democrat because the Democrats consider me a chattel and possibly might have always considered me, because their record from the beginning has been inimical to my interests, because they had become notorious in their hatred of the Negroes as a man, have refused him the ballot, have murdered, beaten, and outraged him, and refused him of his rights." So Democrats are the party of segregation. Democrats favor a low tariff. Tariffs tend to hurt farmers. So the South is made up of a lot of farmers, a lot of cotton growers, so they want a low tariff. Catholics and Protestants support the Democrat Party. Catholics are mostly located in the North. The Democrats are not really against alcohol. They don't try to shut it down. They don't try to stop it from being sold. They kind of want the government to let people drink and leave that alone. Democrats tend to have the support of labor, although that's not always the case, but the average city worker in a factory tends to be Democrat. They also have a lot of support from farmers, and their strongest geographical area is the South. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about political campaigns and issues. Campaigning was very different during the Gilded Age. Americans of today would have a hard time understanding how elections unfolded back then. Presidents during the Gilded Age did not actively campaign. They would literally sit on their front porch and give speeches to the thousands of people who came to visit them. Now, other people, party regulars, did travel the country giving speeches and writing pamphlets. So there is campaigning, but just not by the person running for office. A really famous example of this is James A. Garfield. He campaigns for president from his front porch in Ohio, and people come to him. There's a good example of how the Republicans support civil rights. A black singing group called the Fisk Jubilee Singers come to Garfield's home in Ohio and sing to him while he's sitting in his house, and this moves him very much. He tells them after the song, "I tell you now that I would rather be with you and defeated than against you and victorious." So a good example of how campaigning is done from your front porch and how Republicans support civil rights. Turnout was very high in the presidential elections during the Gilded Age. More voters turned out proportionally in elections from 1876 to 1892 than at any other time in American history. The party faithful marched in torchlight parades. Republican and Democrat paraphernalia flooded the nation. You know, there's mugs, there's posters, there's campaign buttons and handkerchiefs. They were adorned with the symbols of the Republican and Democrat Party. The elephant and the donkey, these are the symbols that had been adopted for the parties in 1870. In the 1870s. Now, one thing that happened in almost every election was something called waving the bloody shirt. This was when Republicans reminded voters that it was the Democrats who started the Civil War. Their message to voters was, don't vote for the party of treason. And I want to read to you an example of this. So the Republican governor, Oliver Morton of Indiana, he was speaking in 1866 during the election year, and this is what he said. Every unregenerate rebel calls himself a Democrat. Every bounty jumper, every sneak who ran away from the draft calls himself a Democrat. Every man who murdered Union prisoners by cruelty and starvation calls himself a Democrat. Every New York rioter who in 1863 burned up little children in colored asylums, who robbed, ravished, and murdered indiscriminately calls himself a Democrat. In short, the Democrat Party may be described as a common sewer into which is emptied every element of inhumanity and barbarism which has discolored the age. So that's an example of waving the bloody shirt, reminding voters that Democrats started the Civil War, tried to break up the Union. Why would you want to give them back political power if that's what they did in the past? Voting is also done very differently in the Gilded Age. There was no secret ballot or uniform ballot in America. The parties would print up their own ballots, which were often a uniform color, and hand them out to people at voting stations. People would publicly vote by going to a polling place and get the colored ballot and then turn it into the voting box. You know, everyone present could see who you were voting for. They just would look at what color your ticket was. If you had a Republican ballot and you wanted to vote for a Democrat, you had to scratch out the name of the person on the Republican ballot and write the Democrat person's name in, and vice versa. So voting is very different during this era. There's lots of contentious election issues during the Gilded Age. Civil War pensions always come up. Republicans tend to support Civil War pensions. Union veterans make up a large voting bloc, and Republicans know that if they can give them wartime pensions, they'll get their votes later on. Democrats tend to oppose Civil War pensions. Education is another big issue. There's battles fought over whether or not instruction in the classroom should be in English. There's a lot of immigrants to America during this time. Battles are fought over whether or not state aid should go to religious schools. Catholics tended to favor state aid to their Catholic private schools, but many Protestants didn't want state aid going to Catholic schools. They believe Catholicism subverts Republican government. In 1848, there was a series of uprisings in Europe called the Revolutions of 1848. These were revolutions by Republicans, people wanting self-government against monarchies. The monarchies tended to be Catholic, so the Catholic Church supported the monarchies in crushing these revolutions. So a lot of Protestant Americans look at the Catholic Church and say, the Catholic Church supports monarchy, supports aristocracy. America is kind of against that. The American Revolution was fought to kind of rid ourselves of stuff like that. So education ends up being something that's fought over. There's also a lot of fight over alcohol, whether or not businesses should be open, and whether or not recreation should take place on Sunday. Probably the biggest national issue is the tariff, which doesn't sound very exciting, but that's what it was. Like I said before, a tariff is a tax on what a nation imports. Now, the goal of the tariff is twofold. One, the government wants to raise revenue, and two, the government wants to protect domestic industries. The way the tariff often worked is that Republicans in Congress would raise taxes on manufactured goods, such as clothing or farm implements that came from Europe. This made buying foreign more expensive. The thinking went that this would cause more Americans to buy goods manufactured in America. Republican President Benjamin Harrison said in 1892, quote, "The protective system has been a mighty instrument for the development of the national wealth." Other countries would often retaliate by raising taxes on things the United States sold in Europe. Since the South's economy was centered on exporting cotton, the tariffs placed on Southern cotton by Europe made the Southern cotton less competitive with cotton from places like India or Egypt. So that's why Democrats tended to oppose the tariff. It hurt the South. After the huge victories in the 1888 elections, the Republicans pushed through one of the biggest tariffs in American history. It was called the McKinley Tariff. It was named after Republican Congressman William McKinley from Ohio. He's going to be kind of the last president of the Gilded Age. He's kind of a transitional president between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. The tariff rate in the McKinley tariff was almost 50%, and the tariff threatened to retaliate even more against any country who raised their tariff on American goods. Probably the most well-known fact of political life in the Gilded Age was the urban political machine. An urban political machine was just a Democrat or Republican organization located in a city that sought to use politics to hold power and to hand out favors. Most political machines are Democrats because Democrats are strong in the cities and Republicans are more strong in rural areas, but there are some Republican machines as well. The political machine was basically combining politics and social services in a sense. Political machines provided for families and immigrants. They provided many things for them. When you would come to America and you didn't have a job, somebody from the local Democrat political machine would show up and say, hey, I can get you a job in a factory. Maybe somebody dies in a factory accident. The political machine might send a representative to give you some money to help you pay the rent or bring food. Sometimes political machines would send people out to go to weddings or funerals to kind of tell people in the community, hey, we're here for you. They would intercede on the behalf of families when facing a problem with the government. Now, the issue is political machines are government employees. Usually, it's not like this is just a political party doing something out of its altruistic motives. This is all done in return for votes. Probably the most famous political boss of the Gilded Age was William M. Tweed. He's often called Boss Tweed. He ran the Democrat Party political machine in New York. His political machine was known as Tammany Hall. He was a political boss and state senator in New York. Perhaps the most famous example of Tammany Hall corruption as far as spending money was the county courthouse in New York. Its budget was $250,000, so this courthouse is supposed to cost $250,000. The carpets alone end up costing over $350,000, and the total cost ends up being over $13 million. This is because Tweed controlled the money and he funneled it to Democrat Party contractors. Political machines often use public money to enrich their own political supporters. You can kind of see some pictures of this. The most famous political cartoonist of the era, Thomas Nast, he was a big critic of corrupt politics, of political machines. There's a famous political cartoon called the Tammany Tiger, as you can see. It showed a wild Tammany tiger about to devour the Republic. That's the woman on the ground that he's about to eat. He's already killed Justice and Liberty. You can see them in the background. Boss Tweed looks on from the stands like a Roman emperor of old, how they would have watched Christians being eaten by the wild animals in the Roman Colosseum. So Thomas Nast criticizes political machines. Another major problem in the Gilded Age was fee-based government. Fee-based government was basically when agents who were tasked with carrying out government policy or enforcing laws collected fees for their services. Citizens who required government services paid a fee for those services. People who violated a law or a code had to pay penalties. The government offered fees for doing things such as arresting criminals, collecting taxes, and performing other services. So, for example, a judge would receive a fee for every immigrant application he processed. The fee was paid by the immigrant. Sometimes the judge would charge extra and pocket the money. So this leads to a lot of corruption because the people that provide the government service, they collect extra fees for themselves, they pocket the money. So it can be very expensive going to a government official if you need anything. Now, as the Gilded Age progresses, more and more people are appointed to government jobs based on merit, not party affiliation. So fee-based government over time becomes less and less of an issue, and prices start to become uniform, so there's not corruption. The biggest reform of the Gilded Age probably was the Pendleton Act. James Garfield, the president, was assassinated in 1881 by a man, Charles Guiteau, who thought he should have gotten a job in the administration but didn't. So the Pendleton Civil Service Act gets passed a couple years later. It creates a nonpartisan civil service commission, and it's authorized to fill federal jobs by examination. So the old way is when a Republican wins an election, he goes to Washington, he fires all the Democrats and hires Republicans to do jobs in the post office, for example. It doesn't matter whether they're qualified or not. They're Republicans, so we want them in position to give jobs. The Democrats did the same thing. So the Pendleton Act tries to change that and say, you're now going to have to take a civil service test, and if you pass the test that says you're competent to work at the post office, you're not going to get fired when a different party wins an election. You're going to be able to keep your job. Now, at first, this law only applies to about 10% of federal jobs, but this percentage grows in later years. Now, there's still politicians who know how to subvert the system, and they keep appointing political hacks instead of qualified civil service workers. This happens well into the 1900s, but the Pendleton Act tries to address it. Now, the courts were a very important institution during the Gilded Age. The courts, both at the state, federal, and the Supreme level in the late 19th century, tended to take a pro-property rights point of view in their decisions. They saw it as their job to defend private property and individuals against encroachments by state and federal government. This often meant that laws aimed at curtailing or reforming how business owners use their property, such as factories, were struck down as unconstitutional. In the case N. Re. Jacobs of 1885, the New York State Court of Appeals struck down a law prohibiting manufacturing in tenements. Business owners used to put tobacco in the tenements, and they would make cigarettes in their tenements. So it's like basically having a manufacturing establishment in your apartment. There were laws passed to stop this, but the court struck this down because they said, look, if the factory owner and the employee want to make an agreement where they make cigarettes in their house, the government shouldn't stop them from doing that. It's a free contract. They can enter into it if they want to, or they cannot. In 1886, another case, Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad Company. This went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court interprets the 14th Amendment as protecting corporations as well as individuals. So they start to say that corporations have rights, and basically that means the businessman that runs the corporation has rights as a businessman, not just as an individual citizen. Another important concept, a judicial concept, was that of substantive due process, and that's kind of a big fancy word, but here's what it means. Substantive due process held that the due process of the 14th Amendment not only protected certain legal procedures, but also protected certain rights unrelated to procedures. So, for example, the 14th Amendment says that no state shall, quote, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, what that means is you cannot be put in jail for a crime without going through the process of having a fair trial and being convicted. You can have your liberty taken away, you just have to have a fair process whereby your liberty is taken away. But what substantive due process holds is that you can't be deprived of your property regardless of the procedure. So this applies to businessmen in particular. The state government and federal government sometimes tried to regulate factories. The process they used to regulate them was laws passed by the states or by Congress. Substantive due process says that you can't even do that. You can't pass a law, which is a procedure, that deprives someone of their ability to exercise their property rights the way they see fit. So if you are the boss and you want to set up a manufacturing of cigars in a tenement, you have every right to do that under substantive due process because you're going into a free contract, a free agreement with somebody to work in that tenement, and the government shouldn't be able to take away your right to do that. Now, the preeminent jurist of the Gilded Age was Stephen J. Field, and I just want to read a quote to you that kind of sums this up. He says, "As the inequalities in the conditions of men become more and more marked and angry menaces against order find vent in loud denunciations, it becomes more and more imperative, the imperative duty of the court to enforce with a firm hand every guarantee of the Constitution. So what he's saying is, as things become more unequal in the Gilded Age, as workers feel they're getting treated worse and worse, it's more important than ever for the courts to protect property rights, because he's kind of saying the mob of workers will want the government to restrict property rights, and he says the courts need to protect property rights. Now, during the Gilded Age, there's also kind of this movement, or what's been called the ideology of individualism. There's an emphasis placed on individualism. During the Gilded Age, you get men like Carnegie or Rockefeller who are self-made men. That's praised during this era. Now, America has always been proud of their self-made men. This goes all the way back to the colonial and revolutionary eras with men like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. One of the most famous Gilded Age proponents of individualism was Horatio Alger. He helped popularize the idea of individualism and the self-made man. During the Gilded Age, he published more than 100 short novels. These novels were usually aimed at young boys, and they all had the same message. You know, if you work hard, if you're honest, if you're thrifty and ambitious, you'll eventually succeed. Horatio Alger's most famous book was called Ragged Dick. Sometimes it's also called Street Life in New York with the Boot Blacks. It first appeared in serial form in 1867, and then next year it's published in book form. It tells the story of an orphan boy who lives in New York. He had none of the qualities that will lead to success, but he eventually learns them and becomes successful. If you look at the cover of Alger's books, you can see that they are all about starting at the bottom, working hard, taking chances, and then rising to success. Some people during the Gilded Age criticize this idea of the self-made man, and historians later on have criticized this. There's something called the Horatio Alger myth. That's the idea that the values found in Alger's stories are not true. Those values will not help you succeed. The Horatio Alger myth kind of says that during the Gilded Age, it's actually corruption and ruthlessness and political inside deals that help you succeed, not hard work, thrift, ambition. One of the most famous ideas of the Gilded Age was that of social Darwinism. Some thinkers during the Gilded Age took Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and applied it to society. The British philosopher Herbert Spencer argued that society advanced or progressed through competition and what he called survival of the fittest. He's the one that coined that phrase, survival of the fittest. His idea became known as social Darwinism. Some basic beliefs of social Darwinists are that private property is a sacred right, industrialization is a benefit to mankind, including the workers, industrialization is here to stay, classes should not be at war with each other. Social Darwinists say if you're a millionaire, your money should be as safe to you as if you only have $1. Society should not take that money from you through taxes or crime. Each class should respect and protect the rights of the other classes. And they argued that humanity is just like nature. Some are more fit to survive and flourish. So people like Carnegie and Rockefeller are more fit than their workers who work in their factories. Now, the Yale professor of sociology, William Graham Sumner, he's the one that championed Spencer's ideas in America. Sumner viewed competition as a law of nature that can, quote, no more be done away with than gravitation. So this idea of survival of the fittest, it's just a natural law. It's the way things are. You can't reform it. You can't go against it no matter what kind of laws you try to pass. So men such as Carnegie and Rockefeller, they're rich and successful because they were the fittest men in society. Social Darwinists believe that it was useless to try and pass legislation or reform society to make it more egalitarian. It's natural that many people were at the bottom of society and a few were at the top. Some of Sumner's most famous writings include What Social Classes Owe Each Other, The Absurd Attempt to Make the World Over, and That It Is Not Wicked to Be Rich. Now, people did push back against this. The journalist Henry Demarest Lloyd, he attacked social Darwinism and laissez-faire, the laissez-faire attitude of the government during the Gilded Age. He argued that industrialization is harmful, the free market is harmful, people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, captains of industry are harmful, big business is bad, and competition is harmful to society. He said the more competition you have, the worse things get for society. The most famous reformer during the Gilded Age was Henry George. He was from Philadelphia, but then he went out west to California to make his fortune. He has a lot of jobs out there, but he's mainly known for being a journalist and a reformer. He had trouble supporting his family. There's one story he tells where he was so desperate at one point he went up to a man on the street to ask for $5 so he could help support his family. The man gave him the money, but George later wrote in his diary that he was so desperate he thought about killing that man if he said no. And Henry George thought this is not how things are supposed to be. Now, Henry George is not a bum. He is a hard worker, but he can't really find work. That happened to a lot of people during this era. There's numerous depressions during the Gilded Age, and people that want to work can't find work. So he thinks that's a problem with society if you can't find work and you're willing to work. So in 1879, he writes a really big book called Progress and Poverty. He basically says it's not your fault if you're poor, if you're willing to work hard. It's rather the fault of society at large. You're poor because society is structured the wrong way. He says that unjust distribution is the cause of poverty. He says that everyone could be rich and well off if we just tweak society enough. He wants to cut taxes on capital and labor, but he wants to have huge taxes on land. So that's kind of his scheme for raising enough money to kind of help people is tax land heavily. Now, he's asked to run for mayor of New York City in 1886 as the candidate of the working class. He runs and finishes second ahead of the future president Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt ran and was third place. So Henry George beats Teddy Roosevelt in an election, even though Henry George came in second and didn't become mayor. Now, during the Gilded Age, women are involved in politics, and as we kind of get into the progressive era, we'll see how women become more and more involved in politics. Now, American women had always played a role in politics. Some states during the Revolutionary period even allowed women to vote, but over time they tended to rescind those rights, so women lost the right to vote in some areas. In 1848, women met at Seneca Falls and adopted the Declaration of Sentiments, basically calling for women to have the same rights as men. The women's suffrage movement, or the movement to get the right to vote, it split during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Some women focused on winning the right to vote for black men, believing that women had a different but complementary role to play in American politics. But other women within the suffrage movement, they thought that they deserved the right to vote just as much as black men did. So this actually divides the women's movement after the Civil War. But towards the end of the 1800s and the start of the 1900s, women kind of start to form these groups again to push for the right to vote. In 1890, the National American Woman Suffrage Association was created. Suffragists debated on how to achieve the right to vote. They basically decided to abandon the effort to get a constitutional amendment. That's how black men had got the right to vote, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Instead, women decided to focus on getting the right to vote in individual states. And some western states did allow women to vote during the Gilded Age. Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, and Utah had given women the right to vote during this era. In other places, women could vote, but usually just on local issues such as school board or whether or not to raise taxes. One anti-suffrage resolution stated that, quote, "Men are ordained to govern in all forceful and material things because they are men, while women by the same decree of God and nature are equally fitted to bear rule in a higher and more spiritual realm." So some people say that men and women should play a role in politics and government. They just have different areas that they're good at. And some women believe this, that they better serve society as the conscience or the moral of society. Many men and women believe in the idea of separate spheres for each other, for the different sexes. This still allows women to play a role in public society, but some women want the right to vote regardless. The journalist Retha Child Dorr said that, quote, "A woman's place is home, but home is not contained within the four walls of an individual house. Home is the community. The city is full of people that are the family, and badly do the home and family need the mother." So some women say we need the right to vote so that we can enact laws that help the family live better in the new age of industrialization. Women during the Gilded Age and before worked in uplifting activities such as fighting prostitution, helping the poor, and advocating for prison reform and the way those with mental illnesses were treated. So women are involved in political issues during the Gilded Age, but usually not by voting. It's usually through activism. One of the biggest women's organization was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Women throughout the nation gathered in prayer and held crusades outside of saloons, hoping to get the owners to close their doors. The saloon was a place where men could spend what little money they had on drinking and gambling. This meant less money for their family, and oftentimes it also meant that they came home drunk and mistreated their family, their wives, their children. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union was one of the leading women's organizations of the day, and their goal was to basically decrease the amount of drinking in the United States. The WCTU was led by Frances Willard. She focused on having women use their appeal as the conscience of society and the more morally superior sex to win reform and the right to vote. Some women earlier in the Gilded Age said, "We deserve the right to vote just because it's a natural right. You can't deny us our rights." Frances Willard takes a little different approach. She says that women are morally superior to men. They have morally superior consciences. So basically, if we give them the right to vote, they'll vote in reforms that will help protect the nation, help make it a more moral, a more just place. Her political motto was home protection. So basically, give us the right to vote and we can better protect our homes by shutting things down like saloons that threaten our homes. Willard also has a do everything program, and women focus on other issues through this, such as labor conditions, prostitution, public health, even international peace. There's a lot of really interesting political cartoons or advertisements for ending alcohol. One of my favorites is "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." So basically, you can't kiss your sweetheart if you drink alcohol. A lot of people took pledges through the National Christian Temperance Union to basically say, "I promise not to drink anymore." Okay, the last thing I kind of want to talk about is civil rights during the Gilded Age. Now, when Reconstruction ended in 1877, so did the chance that blacks would have equal rights in the South. Without the U.S. Army having a presence in the South, the Democrat Party and groups affiliated with it, such as the Ku Klux Klan, made sure that blacks stayed away from polling places during election time. There were actually a lot of blacks elected to political office in the South. There was even something like 14 blacks elected to the House of Representatives, and Mississippi elected 2 black senators during Reconstruction, because blacks make up a large percentage of the South. So when the Union Army was in the South, blacks actually voted in high numbers, and they elected people to state and national offices. But once the Union Army leaves the South, the Ku Klux Klan and Democrat groups spread terror throughout the region and stopped them from voting. So as a result, blacks are driven out of politics. There's a lot of ways that the Democrat Party disenfranchises blacks in the South. There's literacy tests, there's poll taxes, there's intimidation. When you show up to vote, there would be armed men there, and the message was, if you vote, we're going to come visit you later at your house and maybe kill you. One literacy test said this, quote, "Every voter shall be able to read any section of the Constitution of this state, or he shall be able to understand the same when read to him or give a reasonable interpretation thereof." So if you could read a section of the Constitution, you could vote. If not, you could not vote. This was the literacy test. And I kind of want to show you how this works. there's a lot of whites in the South that can't read or wouldn't be able to interpret the Constitution. So when you go to vote, if you're a white Southerner, a Democrat, you'll get this read to you. This is Section 8 of the Mississippi State Constitution. It says, all persons resident in this state, citizens of the United States, are hereby declared citizens of the state of Mississippi. So that's what you would get if you were a white person going to vote. Now, if you're black and you're coming to the polling place, the Democrats know you're going to vote Republican, so they will read this section of the Constitution to you. All lands comprising a single tract sold in pursuance of decree of court or execution shall first be offered in subdivisions not exceeding 160 acres or 1/4 section, and then offered as an entirety, and the price bid for the latter shall control only when it shall exceed the aggregate of the bids for the same in subdivisions as aforesaid. That's very confusing. How is anybody supposed to interpret that? So when you're a black person and you try to interpret that, they say, nope, that's not the right interpretation. You can't vote. And this was a legal way to keep blacks from voting. And just in case the white voter couldn't read or interpret what he was given, there were grandfather clauses passed in southern states. And these grandfather clauses said, if your grandfather could have voted in 1867 or earlier, you can vote now. Well, right before the Civil War and even right after the Civil War, nobody that had a black relative, a black grandfather, could vote. So they're not going to be able to vote later on. But all the whites in the South, their grandparents, their grandfathers could vote, so the whites will be able to keep voting. So this is kind of how literacy tests are used to keep blacks from voting. Another way that blacks are disenfranchised in the South is through something called gerrymandering. This is basically when you draw a legislative district in such a way to ensure a particular outcome. So let's say that in the middle of a state is a big city and there's a lot of blacks in that city. Instead of having those blacks be one congressional district, they'll divide sections of that city and put them into other congressional districts. That way it dilutes the black vote and they won't be able to elect anybody. The Gilded Age is also the era when segregation starts to become enshrined in law. Now, there's a history of segregation in America, but this is when it legally becomes enshrined. Segregation is just the separating of the races in things such as the public accommodation. So this starts to happen during the Gilded Age. These segregation laws are known as Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws say that blacks can't eat in a restaurant with whites, blacks can't travel on a train with whites. That's what Jim Crow laws do. Now, segregation on trains first began to appear in the 1870s, and soon it spreads to other institutions. So over time, things like schools, restaurants, hotels, cemeteries, movie theaters, these things become segregated throughout the South. Access to jobs, the courts, and social services are also often denied to blacks because of the policies of the Democrat Party. By the late 1890s, much of the South was legally segregated by state law. Now, there's attempts to prevent segregation or to undo it in the South. In 1891, Georgia adopts the first Jim Crow law applying to streetcars. So they segregate streetcars in Georgia. Over the next 15 years, blacks boycott segregated streetcars in over 25 cities throughout the South. The Savannah Tribune, a newspaper, told this to its readers: "Do not trample on our pride by being Jim Crowed, walk." So this happened some 60 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Blacks in the Gilded Age were boycotting streetcars or trains that refused to let them sit where they wanted to. The constitutionality of segregation did go before the Supreme Court. Now, in 1890, Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act. This was a Jim Crow law that segregated railroad cars based on race. Now, Homer Plessy is the man who challenges this law. Now, Homer Plessy, he is considered 7/8 white and 1/8 black. And he looks white to the naked eye, but he had a relative in his past that was black. Plessy decides to challenge this law as a violation of the 14th Amendment. Plessy goes aboard trains and sits in the whites only section to basically get arrested, but because he looks white, nobody actually arrests him. His legal team actually has to go to the railroad company, to the conductor, and say, hey, that man he appears white, but he actually is considered black under law. So he ends up getting arrested, and this case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. This Supreme Court case was decided in 1896. It's known as Plessy v. Ferguson. This is a very important Supreme Court case to remember. The court rules 7-1 that Plessy's legal rights were not violated. So they say as long as segregated facilities are equal, they are legal. The court made a distinction between legal equality and social equality. The Supreme Court argued that blacks and whites were not made equal by nature. So therefore, laws don't need to declare that. Justice Henry Brown of the Supreme Court said, quote, if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. So the state, they argued, could not force whites to associate with blacks, but the state could and must ensure that segregated facilities were equal. So that's, in theory, where the doctrine of separate but equal comes from, is Plessy v. Ferguson. Segregation is considered okay as long as both facilities are equal. Now, that's usually never the case. The black facilities are never equal. They're always more run down and just kind of crummier. Now, there is a dissenting view on the Supreme Court. Justice John Harlan, I want to read to you something he says. He said this: I deny that any legislative body or judicial tribunal may have regard to the race of citizens which the civil rights of those citizens are involved. Indeed, such legislation as that here in question is inconsistent not only with that equality of rights which pertains to citizenship, national and state, but with the personal liberty enjoyed by everyone within the United States. In the view of the Constitution, in the eyes of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. Now, he's the dissenting vote. So Plessy v. Ferguson will be the law of the land. Separate but equal will be the law of the land until the 1950s, and we'll talk about that at a later point. Now, there's a really interesting civil rights activist of the 1880s and 1890s that I kind of want to talk about to close this lecture. Her name is Ida B. Wells. Now, she has a lot of run-ins with segregation. In 1883, she was forcibly thrown off a train. She had sat in the section reserved for white ladies. She had bought a ticket for that and sat in it, and they threw her off. She bit and scratched the conductor as he kind of struggled to throw her off. Later in 1877, she sat in a white-only section of a train, and she was also thrown off this train. So she kind of has some history fighting segregation. Ida B. Wells becomes the nation's biggest anti-lynching crusader. She's kind of the nation's moral conscience for anti-lynching purposes. Now, lynching is the execution of an accused criminal, usually by hanging, but sometimes by other methods, including shooting or burning, by mobs without official legal sanction. Lynchings were often public spectacles that included acts of torture such as castration. So basically, lynching is when you get somebody you think committed a crime, and instead of giving them a fair trial and allowing the courts to decide their guilt or innocence, you just declare them guilty and execute them on the spot. Some people that are lynched are criminals who did murder or rape somebody, but oftentimes they were just accused of it and they didn't actually do it, but they were executed nonetheless. Lynching is an old practice, mostly practiced out west in America where there's not much law and order. Its origins are not racial. In fact, in the 1880s, more whites were lynched nationally than blacks. But by the 1880s and 1890s, lynching becomes associated with racial issues in the South mostly. Now, the numbers are not known for sure, but estimates are that some 5,000 Americans, mostly blacks, were lynched between the 1880s and 1960s. About 70% of those 5,000 were black, and about 30% of those lynched were white. There's a really terrible book called Without Sanctuary. I say it's terrible because it's a picture history of lynching in America. If you ever are interested, check that book out or get it off of Amazon. It's very gruesome, but it shows you kind of the stark reality of how terrible lynching was. Wells eventually gets forced out of her home in Memphis because she writes in a newspaper called Free Speech. She writes editorials that criticize segregation and lynching. She eventually flees to New York, and in 1892 she publishes a really famous pamphlet called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And there's kind of an interesting quote I want to read to you. In her pamphlet she says, "The lesson this teaches," meaning lynching, "and which every Afro-American should ponder well, is that a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man who is always the aggressor knows he runs a great risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have a greater respect for Afro-American life. The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so, the more he is insulted and outraged and lynched." So basically she's saying, make sure you own a gun if you're a black person. A white person is less likely to lynch you if they know that they're going to get shot trying to do it. And gun control is not really a big issue during the Gilded Age, but it tends to be used against blacks to deny them their civil rights under the Second Amendment to own a firearm. A lot of Civil War soldiers that are blacks, when they leave the army, they want to keep their gun because when they go home, they know that they're going to have to deal with stuff. But most gun control laws of this era do kind of focus on taking away black people's rights to defend themselves. So kind of keep this civil rights stuff in mind as we go throughout this course. You know, we think the 1880s, the 1890s are so long ago, but some of the issues that came up during this era, such as segregation, they reach far into the 1900s. We really don't deal with segregation, fixing it, until the 1950s and 60s. So that's not that long ago, the 60s. So stuff from the 1880s and 90s still has to be dealt with in the latter parts of the 20th century. So keep that in mind. So next time we'll kind of move on to the progressive era.